with the creative theme because you learn from the people who organize these things. You keep it feisty and you keep it fun, but also you make sure you're addressing the reality of the conversation. And so we said, mind my trauma. I want us to think of that in a really pragmatic sense of, hi man, you know how if someone bumps into you, you're like, excuse me, similar so with our traumas, right? Like, hey, mind my trauma. But in this instance, I want us to start personifying it as in mind my personal trauma. I like what Banati is doing there, Gadi video. If you can, please don't be shy. Please do turn on your video, and let's see each other as we're interacting. If you're comfortable with that, um, right? What is trauma? Trauma, by definition, is a Greek word that refers to a wound. Okay, and if we're going to think of wounds, a wound that goes on unaddressed can become septic. Once it becomes septic, the infection goes deeper. The deeper the infection, the deeper the harm. Metaphorically speaking, that means now your trauma takes root into your life. And going back with the metaphor of a wound, as time progresses, ultimately, with the septic wound, it goes deeper and may lead to amputation. Now, from a mental health perspective, that can look anything from major depression, major anxiety, to suicide ideation, or ultimately suicide attempts. So, what we don't want is to go that far. And if you have been there, please, this is not a judgment space. This is a raising an awareness space. This is a holding space together where we can relate, connect, and hopefully step away healed, right? So, trauma is a wound. Okay. And I want to just speak to it in terms of what the terms are, right? In a context from Levine, according to Levine, the factor that determines whether an event could be classified as traumatic to a person is whether its impact remains unresolved. Okay? It's an event where the impact remains unresolved. The importance of perception of the real nature of the event by an individual is tantamount to ascertaining whether an experience was traumatic to a person. What that tells us is that trauma is relevant to each individual. Okay. The term perceived life-threatening experience or perceived overwhelming experience features repeatedly throughout literature. So trauma is relative. Any incident or experience that happens to you that leaves a lasting impact and stored in the various parts, I'm trying not to jump ahead of myself there, stored within us is what trauma is. Okay. It's an event, it has a lasting impact, and it remains there longer than we'd like it to. Okay. Then Spiegel describes trauma as the essence of traumatic stress as helplessness, which defines as a loss of control over one's body. Okay. This is also known as a trauma response. He continues to clarify this in the following words: the mental imprint of such frightening experiences sometimes takes the form of loss of control over parts of our mind. Traumatic incidents and experiences lead us to potentially lose control, not only of our bodies, but also of our minds. Clinically speaking, trauma does alter brain function. It literally rewires the neurological activity of your brain because of what happened. How long you've endured it goes a long way as well. All right. So it's a form of loss, control over parts of our mind, identity, our memory, and our consciousness. Sometimes after a traumatic experience, people completely lose memory. That's part of the impact, or the vast impact of trauma. Okay. Memory and consciousness, just as physical control is regained. For those who might have endured a physical accident, your body is completely traumatized, no longer knows how to function, even doing things that it used to do. So it needs to be retaught, right? In order for the body to be able to manage and do what it needs to do. Sorry, just need to quickly check something here. My apologies. Just hang on for me. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, the call I was waiting for came through text. Okay, so we know that that's out the way. Sorry about that. Okay, so what we're saying is that the impact of trauma lasts as far as altering our identity, our memory, our consciousness, and even our physical abilities, right? It's described as a toxic condition, mixture of intense anxiety, absolute helplessness, and loss of control. Imagine feeling you have no control over what's happening, feeling you have no control over your own mind, your own thoughts, because of how someone spoke to you, because of how someone treated you, because of how you grew up, and all those kind of things. Okay, so that's what trauma is. But again, just to make sure we're understanding, what is trauma? It is an event or an experience that leaves a negative or unresolved lasting impact. It is a mental imprint of frightening experiences, some forming a loss of control over parts of our mind, of our bodies, our identity, our memory, and sometimes even our consciousness. It alters our perceptions of a perceived, which leads us to constantly perceive ourselves to be living in a threatening situation, a threatening stance at all times, to a point where we become overly overwhelmed by what has happened. It is a wound in the mind and or our bodies. It leads us to lose control over our own minds and or our bodies. It is a toxic condition which has a mixture of these intense anxiety, absolute helplessness, and loss of control. I hope that clarifies what trauma is for all of us, right? Then we have different types of trauma. We have violence. We have domestic, we have violence that we see in the streets, road rage, right? We just recently on the M1 lost 5 lives due to road rage, allegedly, right? So violence, victimization, sexual abuse, physical abuse, witnessing domestic abuse, the exposure sometimes to a traumatic incident also creates trauma for you. It's not happening to you, but you witnessing the hurt and the pain of other people negatively impact you, right? This is why even in the Bible, we are called to love one another as we love ourselves. And that's why you will be impacted by witnessing someone else's pain. All right. And when you're not, there's a whole other mental health condition on that, but that's not what we're talking about today. All right. So we have these kind of things. So there's primary trauma where the incident happens to you, secondary trauma where you witness someone close to you go through the thing, or you firsthand witness someone going through the thing. All right. And it goes as far as also then how this alters how we perceive and live our lives, right? So trauma being experienced by a collective group or population can be anything from COVID-19, floods, hurricanes, any natural disasters is a collective trauma. Retrenchment in a workspace, collective trauma, right? So that's what we're referring to there. Then we have individualized trauma. This is me losing my parent. This is me losing my spouse. This is me losing my child. That's happening to me or you. It is an individual experience, right? Rape, as well as also some things that lead to depression, okay? Then we have intergenerational trauma, which is why we're having these conversations, because we're trying to cut that cord, right? Intergenerational trauma is now referring to the transmission of consequences of a trauma from one generation to another. It is a everlasting imprint. My mom went through something that she never shared with me and she never healed from. So she then does the same thing that she did in life that was done to her to me. And then I grow up, I have my child and my issue with my mom that comes from her issue with her mom that was never addressed. Now I'm carrying 3 generations worth of trauma, imposing it on my 4th generation. So that's what we talk about when we talk about generational traumas. We're carrying all these things because we're not addressing the thing that needs to be addressed. Okay, remember, by definition, trauma, lasting, unresolved incident or experience. Okay. Where more than one person suffers through the same ordeal, this is called a shared burden or shared experience. And the way of dealing with this during and after the event differs from each trauma. Okay. So I think I've already touched now on generational trauma, so I'll just pass on that. But how they break this down is into threefold. So with generational trauma is very important to hold on to, because one of the things that we do speak about, not only within our respective churches, but also as a community, is that we need family. That's the first sense of community. And if within our families, we've got survivors of trauma, they are the direct people who've experienced it. Then the children are secondary to that experience or exposure. And this leads to emotional distancing or conflict within the home. Then you have your next generation, which is their children and how they're responding to that. And this can lead to a changed mood or a certain attitude or a certain belief that is held as a result of that unaddressed past trauma that is being carried from year to year, generation to generation. Okay. So let's talk about exactly where is trauma stored in our bodies. Stored rather. Okay. Trauma is stored in the mind. Trauma is also stored in our bodies. And I want us just to just break that down a bit, right? With our minds, trauma is stored there through memory. Being mugged at gunpoint, being mugged at knife point, being hijacked on the way, surviving a rape experience. These are things that happen and are there entrenched in your mind forever. It's not going to go anywhere. But how you choose to perceive it is what trauma therapy helps with, or how you process that is what trauma therapy helps with, right? It doesn't change the reality of what's happened. If anything, it's about making it real, even for you, so that you can release the suppressed emotional charge as a result of the traumatic incident or experience. So trauma is first stored in our minds through memory. Then trauma is stored in our bodies. We call the somatic symptoms of trauma. 2-car crash, maybe it's not fatal, but one of the people or the people who are coming from the accident are literally shaking and trembling. The body is neurologically, physiologically responding immediately to the adrenaline that's coming from the exposure to this traumatic incident and experience. Okay. And excuse me, our bodies then want to respond. And our body is telling you, I'm not okay. When the body has that heightened level of release of cortisol and stress relieving hormones and stress releasing hormones, sometimes the body becomes so overwhelmed, you completely collapse. This is why someone can hear the passing of a loved one and faint. Your mind, body is struggling to what? Just shut down and reboot. This is why in losses, and I want to stick with grieving because that's quite a recent one, right? Under COVID, we lost a lot of people that we love. People that we know lost a lot of people that they love. Even coming out of the COVID pandemic, we still are losing people because yes, this is a way of life, but it is something that we just need to move towards, or learn rather to move in spite of, be able to keep going in spite of what's happened. Okay. So again, with the trauma stored in the body, it can also be through headache, shaking, tremors, heart palpitations, which can translate into panic attacks and. Okay, so trauma is stored one in our minds through memory, and trauma is stored in our bodies. Okay, so again, just to make an emphasis around how trauma is stored in the mind through memory recall, where our senses are very relevant when it comes to trauma, and our bodies are very quick to pick up on that. A certain sound might trigger that. You hearing a banging sound of me dropping a book, in your ear, you hearing the slamming of that car that took you away to go rape you in the bushes. That's how deep it goes, right? You passing through someone in the mall, going to get something at the store, and as you passing, you get a whiff of a certain scent of that man who abused you and your children, right? So it's stored through all our different senses. It can be sound, it can be passing a particular space where a certain incident transpired. Can also be very triggering, where therefore you'll choose to avoid. I don't want to be there. I don't want to be exposed to that because I'm not yet ready. Again, this is why trauma incident reductive therapy, releasing you from what we call a suppressed emotional charge to that particular incident. Okay. So it's through memory recall or replay, also known as overthinking or dwelling on the incident. If we fixate on something, it's like holding up the phone. Technically, the phone is not so heavy, but if I hold it for a long time, it definitely starts becoming heavy, right? It's similar. So when we talk about dwelling or fixating on something, sometimes we do this with intent. Other times we're doing this unconsciously because the memory just won't go away. Okay. Unconscious mind often leading memory blockages or intended emotional suppression. So another thing that happens is that sometimes the mind is by nature intended to defend and protect you. So traumatic incident happens, brain freeze, collapse, reboot, come back. What happened? Why are you guys here? What's going on? Your mind has decided to block it out because confronting or facing or talking about that incident is too traumatic for you within that period of time. This is also why technically with the traumatic incident, it is encouraged that therapy after 72 hours. That means your brain has had enough time to process the incident and gone on and replayed and replayed and replayed, and it's arrived where it needs to arrive technically in your mind. And then we can start doing the work. However, especially under COVID, that technique has been advanced, and there are techniques now being practiced and looked into where there's an interest of doing better as far as being able to provide immediate trauma support or immediate trauma counseling. All right. But again, that's more about crisis containing, where it's happening now. We need to help contain you now, that you do not, in the truest sense of the word, lose your mind because of how your brain is immediately and unconsciously or consciously processing this traumatic experience. I hope I haven't lost you guys there, right? I'm just talking about the emphasis on how trauma is stored within our minds. Then when it comes to our bodies, our faces, clenched jaw, when you think about that particular car accident, when you talk about it, there's a lump in your throat, a tightness in your chest, struggling to breathe, the headache, tension. That's your body telling you there's something that's still not yet being addressed around the particular experience, right? So on our faces, it's stored through clenched jaws, frowning, a sense of smell or sounds, or whatever is heard. In our upper bodies, we're talking about neck and back tension, stiffness, heart palpitations, and clasped hands. Sometimes, for us as specialists, one of the important cues is reading body language whilst paying attention to what the person is saying, the tone, the delivery, right? And that's why counseling it's a humanistic science. It's a social science that requires us looking at you as a system. So we're paying attention to what you're saying versus what your body is doing. Sometimes you're talking about something, but you're also the whole time you're clenching your fists tightly. And we're observing this, and that shows this is in your way of self-comforting. For some, while you're talking about the incident, you it's called self-soothing. You're rocking yourself. That also tells us there might be something a bit more. Again, remember we spoke about suppressed emotional charges. Um, so these are other ways that in our upper bodies that it's stored. In our lower bodies, tense legs, inability to move legs or coiled toes. So same way we can, clench our hands. Sometimes you're coiling your toes because what that means is uzbambile. I don't know how to translate that into English, but you're tensed up. You're holding yourself because you don't feel safe. That's what it boils down to. You no longer feel safe physiologically, emotionally, or mentally, and we need these three safeties. Physical safety means the environment I'm in is not going to cause me harm. Emotional safety says it's okay to share my vulnerability and exposure and how I'm feeling and what I'm going through right now and not feel judged, but accepted, even if we might not agree about how I'm responding. And psychological safety says my views, my opinions, my thoughts are acceptable here. You are willing to hear me, see me, and respect me, even if we don't share the same views. Okay. So we need that. And then the whole body, I spoke about the self-soothing. There's also holding yourself in a fetal position, the shaking, the shivering, back and forth rocking as a self-soothing. And all of this may be conscious or unconscious. More often than not, with someone who's experienced a trauma recently, you might be asked, like, what happened? You can see the accident there, but they're just self-soothing and you're trying to talk to them and they're not even hearing you because their brain is still trying to process what's happened. And it's so important when someone has experienced a trauma that we are gentle. We don't say, don't cry, guys, don't. It's like do everything because the body and the mind needs to process. And as uncomfortable as that might be, it might be screaming for hours. It might be crying endlessly for hours. And this is why with trauma being stored in our bodies, it can become, as mentioned, it is toxic, but it can also really create a chemical internal imbalance, such as that. This is why when we are unhappy, we feel this in our gut, which affects your diet, your ability to eat. Either you overeat or you undereat. And food in itself can be a depressant, right? Or it can be healing. Sometimes eating an apple just suddenly your mood is lifted. But if you have a donut, you feel lethargic and exhausted after. Okay, so you're either depressing yourself through what you're consuming, or you're looking to numb. That's another reason why we take these other foods, because we're looking to numb or avoid talking. So I'll shove my face with ice cream instead. It's better than telling someone that I'm not coping. Right. So this is just some of the impacts. And so trauma stored in our minds through memory. Trauma is also stored in our bodies. Right. Then exactly how does trauma alter us? Losing a sense of safety. I've touched on the three safeties: psychological, emotional, and physical. A loss of danger cues. If you're going to be a bit absent-minded because of that traumatic experience, you might not even realize there's danger coming. Absent-mindedness, right? Loss of trust. I don't trust people, which tends to come from the belief held as a result of the traumatic experience or incident. I was raped by my father. And so fathers are bad, men are bad. Over a incident, I'm holding an entire lifetime worth of a belief. Okay. Shame. I don't want people to see me because we blame ourselves. It's shameful. How can your own father, you're self-judging, right? Loss of intimacy, and intimacy not only in a physiological perspective, but even just the ability to feel comfortable or interact and vulnerable with other people. Disassociation, which is to socially withdraw or to be amongst people, but not be amongst people. Think of that time where you're with your colleagues, it's lunchtime or in a meeting, and they're like, hey, Thuli, Huh? You're there, but you're not there. Loss of physical connection to your body, a physiological numbness. We spoke about emotional numbness, but also a physiological numbness where I'm here and I'm not going to eat because my body technically I don't even feel it. I'm alive, but I'm not really present. Loss of a sense of self, loss of self-worth. The biggest thing about trauma, it alters how we look at ourselves. Self-esteem, self-actualization, self-awareness, everything just out the window. Everything you thought you knew about you completely changes, right? Or the constant reenactment where it's replaying over and over and over and over in your memory, in your thoughts, in your dreams, through people, a smell, a sound. And this is another reason why people tend to disassociate or socially withdraw, because being outside, just, I don't feel safe out there. But it's also not healthy just living in here by yourself. Remember, a wound unaddressed becomes septic. A septic wound causes further harm. An unaddressed septic wound may lead to amputation, and that's not what we want. And I think I'll leave it there for today.